The city streets were buzzing with the usual evening rush. When the flashing red and blue lights cut through the crowd, people turned their heads, curious about what was happening. At the center of it all stood a black man, calm, yet firm, dressed sharply in his uniform. He wasn't a stranger to discipline or respect, but that didn't matter to the two police officers who decided to stop him. Without asking questions, without checking facts, they rushed in with handcuffs ready, assuming the worst. The man's steady voice tried to reason with them, but their minds were already made up. Bystanders whispered, pulling out their phones, some too afraid to step in. Others shocked at the sight of a man in uniform treated like a criminal. As the cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, the officers smirked, believing they had authority on their side. What they didn't know was that the man they were trying to humiliate wasn't just anyone. He carried more weight, more connections, and more power than they could imagine. His silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. He only needed one chance, one call, to remind them of the truth they chose to ignore. The crowd held its breath as he calmly asked for his phone. The officers laughed, thinking nothing of it, but within seconds, everything was about to change. That one call would flip the situation upside down and leave the entire city talking. What happened next, no one could have predicted. The phone was pressed into his hand, and with a calmness that didn't match the tension in the air, he dialed a number. The officers stood nearby, still convinced they were in control, while onlookers leaned closer, curious about who he was calling. The man's voice was steady, respectful, but firm, and though no one could hear the full conversation, the look on his face carried a quiet certainty. It was the kind of look that told everyone watching that the story wasn't going to end the way the officers expected. To understand the weight of that moment, you need to know who this man was. He wasn't just wearing any uniform, it was one that symbolized years of service, dedication, and sacrifice. He had earned every stripe and every ounce of respect that came with it. Yet on that street, none of that mattered. All the officers saw was their own assumption, and all the crowd saw was a clash between authority and dignity. The man had built his life on protecting others, on standing for what was right, but now he was the one being forced into the role of a suspect. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor on the growing crowd that whispered his name, slowly realizing exactly who he was. And as the phone call continued, tension grew heavier. The officers shifted uneasily, still not understanding the storm they had set in motion. The real consequences of their choice were only just beginning to unfold. The crowd around the scene grew thicker, phones raised high, capturing every second. Some whispered that the man was a decorated officer. Others insisted he was even higher ranked, someone with influence far beyond the city streets. Still, the two policemen stood firm, acting as though nothing could touch them. Their faces carried that same mix of arrogance and false confidence, convinced the cuffs gave them the final say. Yet deep down, there was a flicker of unease they tried to hide. The man on the phone never raised his voice, but each word seemed measured, deliberate, almost as if he knew exactly how this moment would play out. His calm only made the crowd more restless. People exchanged looks, wondering why a man of such stature was being treated this way, and why the officers refused to even check his credentials. For some, it was personal, an echo of stories they had lived or seen too many times before. Inside the police car parked nearby, the radio crackled with updates from other patrol units. Still, the two officers ignored it, too focused on proving a point. They thought they were winning. What they couldn't see was how quickly the ground beneath them was shifting. Meanwhile, a young woman in the crowd quietly typed out a message of her own. She recognized the man immediately, and she knew the call he made was not to an ordinary contact. She pressed send, and within moments, word began spreading far beyond that block. The city was about to turn its eyes on this single, charged moment. The air grew heavier with every passing second. The man's call ended, and he slowly lowered the phone, his calm expression unchanged. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but their pride kept them rooted in place. To them, he was just another man in cuffs. But to the crowd, he was now a figure of quiet power. Someone who clearly wasn't as ordinary as they first assumed. Whispers rippled through the onlookers like a wave. A few people began naming his rank aloud, voices filled with disbelief, and soon the murmurs became louder, harder to ignore. The officers stiffened, their grip on authority slipping as the weight of truth edged closer. One of them tried to hush the crowd, raising his voice, but it only drew more attention. The tension was no longer just between them and the man, it was between them and everyone watching. Far down the block, the sound of engines echoed closer, the kind of arrival that made heads turn before sirens even wailed. The young woman who had sent the message earlier looked toward the street with a knowing glance, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. The officers followed her gaze, and for the first time, doubt flickered openly across their faces. The man in cuffs stood taller, shoulders squared, almost as if he could already sense the shift that was coming. The crowd leaned in, phones steady, breaths held. Something was about to break, and no one knew just how far the fallout would reach. Engines roared closer, until sleek black vehicles came into view, moving with the precision that silenced even the loudest whispers in the crowd. These weren't ordinary patrol cars, and the moment they pulled up, a shift of unease rippled through the officers holding the cuffs. Doors opened in unison, and outstepped figures whose presence commanded instant respect. The crowd gasped, realizing this situation had just climbed to an entirely new level. But before anyone could react, another twist surfaced. A voice crackled over the officers' radios, urgent and sharp, demanding their immediate attention. The message wasn't routine, it carried the kind of authority that could override everything. The officers froze, caught between following the call from their superiors and facing the growing presence in front of them. Their confidence faltered, yet their grip on the cuffs remained tight. A final attempt to prove they were still in control. The man in uniform said nothing. His silence spoke louder than words, a calm that only deepened the mystery of who he truly was. The young woman in the crowd watched closely, her expression shifting from concern to something closer to anticipation, as if she already knew the second wave of this conflict would be even bigger than the first. The crowd felt it too. Phones stayed locked on the scene, recording what now seemed less like an arrest and more like a collision of powers. Every second ticked heavier, and the true scale of the man's influence was about to be revealed. The black vehicles lined the street, and within moments, high-ranking officials stepped out, their sharp uniforms and commanding presence leaving no doubt about who held the real authority. The crowd fell silent, sensing the turning point. One of the newcomers approached calmly, glanced at the handcuffed man, and his expression hardened. With a single order, the cuffs were removed, and the officers who placed them there were told to step aside. The tension broke like a wave. Gasps rippled through the crowd as realization sank. In the man they had just witnessed being humiliated wasn't only respected, he was one of the highest-ranking figures in the city's security force. The same system the two officers thought they controlled was now standing firmly against them. Their smirks were gone, replaced with panic as they understood the magnitude of their mistake. The man flexed his wrists, his calm never faltering, and simply nodded to the official beside him. He didn't need to shout or argue. The power of truth spoke louder than any words. The officers were escorted away, their careers collapsing in the same moment they had tried to assert false authority. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others stunned at the swiftness of the reversal. But just as the man turned to leave, the young woman who had alerted others stepped forward. In a quiet but steady voice, she revealed she wasn't just a bystander, she was an investigative journalist who had been following reports of similar incidents for months. This moment wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger story. The street slowly returned to its rhythm, though the echoes of what had just happened lingered in the air. The crowd dispersed in clusters, still buzzing with disbelief, their phones filled with footage that would soon circle the city. The two officers, once so certain of their power, were led away, their future uncertain but their downfall undeniable. What was meant to be an act of control had become a lesson seen by all. The man in uniform stood quietly, his calm composure unchanged. He didn't speak much, but his presence left an impression stronger than any speech could. Those who had doubted him now understood why he hadn't fought back with anger. His strength came not from proving himself in the moment, but from knowing the truth would always surface. For him, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about showing that dignity and patience could hold more power than arrogance and force. The young journalist lingered for a while longer, scribbling notes, her eyes sharp with determination. She knew this story was bigger than one incident. It was about accountable.